Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. I think today's subject is very interesting for wrestling fans that are over a certain age. And usually it's the coveted 18 to 34 male demographic, or the 18 to 34 demographic. Is that for most of us, especially for me rather, I'm over the age of 35. So you have to ask the question, am I the target demographic for WWE specifically, but for pro wrestling in general? Now, when you have this conversation, this is a conversation I came up with in comparing two articles that I read. And I'm going to read pieces of those articles to you, and then we're going to be discussing the subject. The first article was Mel Magazine did an interview with Dave Meltzer, in which Dave Meltzer talked about different times for different audiences. And the second article was from Slam Wrestling, and a writer who said, it was a guest column from a writer who claimed that he feels like he's not the target demographic of WWE, but that's a good thing. So let's get into, for starters, the Dave Meltzer piece, because I think this is the one time I'm probably not going to attack Dave Meltzer. I'm actually going to agree with Dave Meltzer and think that what he's saying is actually poignant and very important. Dave Meltzer said in this interview, "When I watch old matches, they're never as good as I remember them being. And it's not because they weren't good. I used to say to Terry Funk in the late 80s, God, I watch these 1970s matches and they're so slow. And Terry would say, well, those guys in the 1970s are working for 1970s wrestling fans. They're not working for you. They had no idea what wrestling was going to be 20 years later. And if you, in 2022, look back on a match from 1986, good, bad, or indifferent, just remember, they're not working for you. They're working for people with a very different taste in wrestling. If you're great in your era, then you're a great wrestler, period. But as far as being the greatest of all time goes, how do you fairly compare Pat Patterson or Ric Flair with a guy today? The entire goal of what they're trying to accomplish is completely different." This is probably the smartest thing I've ever heard Dave Meltzer say. And it's absolutely true. As somebody who also watches old matches, I can tell you that a lot of that stuff is geared towards the audience of that time. And the audience of that time did not mind having 4 or 5 minute chin locks. They did not mind certain language being used. They did not mind certain performances. Adrian Street, for instance, or Adrian Adonis, playing into the Gorgeous George, the playing into the homophobia, or the Iron Sheik, or Nikolai Volkov playing into the Foreign Menace. So it was match style. It was also match presentation. It was a lot of things that were of their time, and they're not things that are going to come back. So it does take that into account. You do have to take that into account when you're watching old matches, is that they're not working for you. But then you have to consider, wait a minute, I'm watching wrestling in 2022. Are they working for me? And the answer to that question is probably not. That, AEW says that they are, because they're looking for that 18 to 34 demographic, that older, usually male demographic. WWE is not. And this is where the second article comes in. So it was written by, I want to say Jonathan Schwartz. Yes, Jonathan Schwartz for slamwrestling.net. So the article, which I will try not to read the whole thing, but he talked about the Royal Rumble. And he says, as usual, storylines set during the event, followed by Monday's Raw broadcast, and remaining threads will be advanced on Friday's SmackDown. And as increasingly usual, fans have become quick to voice their discontent. Faced with nearly 9 hours of wrestling, some have taken to the internet to complain about how the shows are booked, how talent is positioned, and the balance of actual wrestling to skits and interviews and general foolishness. To an extent, they have a point. It's a lot of time to fill. And a wrestler that once burst at the seams has been trimmed considerably. And even then, the same faces predominate the programs. An awful lot of talent just aren't being used. or are placed in positions that belie their talent. At least that's my perspective. I may not love what I see on WWE TV these days, but at least some criticism needs to be tempered by knowing my place in WWE and broader wrestling fandom. Let's face it, I and fans like me are no longer the sole or target audience. And with the amount of content to offer, it's not reasonable to expect that we would be. An awful lot of the criticism directed at WWE comes from people like me, lifelong fans of pro wrestling who fancy themselves as knowledgeable. And to some extent we are, although we aren't privy to what goes on behind the scenes, no matter how dead kayfabe may be. We grew up with the hip superheroic presentation of Hulk Hogan, or Bruno, or Bob Backlund. Fell off the WWE wagon as our younger siblings caught on. It came back to it with the racier storylines of the Attitude Era. But most of us have aged out of the 18 to 35 demographic. If we're lucky, our children have begun watching and enjoying what they see, hooking the next generation of fans. Aspects of WWE's presentation that leave me cold, such as the excessive graphics, silly skits, and goofy characters, are broad enough to appeal to my 7-year-old, who saw John Cena the way I saw Hulk Hogan. When Riddle kicks off his flip-flops to a torrent of computer-animated birds, he laughs. And if that gets him watching, that's a win for me, as a fan, and for the company. The lack of realism that bothers some adults fans is a good thing for kids who are growing up on Marvel superhero movies. And as a parent, it makes the "don't try this at home, this is only a TV show, they aren't really hurting each other" part of my job at building media awareness easier. I think similar logic applies to other choices made by WWE. So he continues, and this is near the end. He says, WWE has hours to fill and has come up with a variety of ways to do it, many of which are aimed at getting a greater number and variety of eyes on the product. I don't have to love everything they put in front of me, and if I really don't love it, I have no shortage of other programs to watch. AEW has put together a leaner, more wrestling-focused product that incorporates a lot of what I loved about the Attitude Era, with its own spin on gender equality and representation. But sometimes we have to realize that we're not the target audience, and it's better to welcome new fans with different perspectives than to let the sports entertainment we love wither and die. So this is a very, very interesting, and I think that this is cool. It's very cool. I think it's a little delusional to say that AEW incorporates a lot of what the Attitude Era. It's like they say shit a lot, but what else do they really have in common with the Attitude Era? Where's the Stone Cold Steve Austins? Where's the Rocks? Where's the big personalities? I don't remember WWE TV having 45-minute matches on them during the Attitude Era. I mean, come on. His overall goal, his overall point is well understood. That AEW is a more mature product because they use the word shit and they use blood and stuff like that. And WWE chooses not to do that. Instead, they choose to go a little bit more on the Looney Tunes cartoon route. And it doesn't really appeal to that many people. And that it is a different wrestling product for a different kind of fan. And when you compare these two articles and you put these two articles together, you have to say that wrestling, even going back to when WWE originally went PG, it was a different product for a different set of fans. And what we saw, even from that point forward, is how WWE actually openly mocks, a lot of times, the older wrestling fan who continues to complain. This kind of goes to remember everybody talks about the Triple H, me and my friend Mark, that promo segment he did on TV. And how it offended so many of these 35 to 36-year-olds who, you probably wasn't 35 at the time. You were, in your mid to late 20s, maybe at the time. You might have been in your early 30s at the time of that promo. And, but that was basically WWE telling you again and again, you're not the target audience. In 2022, when they're doing the birds for Riddle or the lions for Apollo Crews or whatever, are they really trying to win you over? You 40-year-old Cheeto-eating neckbeard who sits behind his computer and talks about how, everything is stupid and everybody sucks and everything. Are you really the target audience? I already know that the answer is no. All right? I already know that. If I go to, and I don't go to these things, but if I watch a Disney movie, for instance, I know that I'm not the target audience of these Disney movies. When I watched Marvel flicks, I knew after the first couple, I wasn't the target audience of these movies. There was a little too many jokes for my taste. Some situations were cut out. For instance, there are still a lot of comic book fans who are upset that Iron Man didn't do Demon in the Bottle, which is the most famous Iron Man story. And their only way of talking about Iron Man's alcoholism was a little bit of Iron Man 2, where he kind of gets a little saucy early in the movie and kind of goes crazy in the suit. And this is, of course, creates War Machine. As War Machine has to stand up and stop Iron Man, who is drunk in his Iron Man suit and whatever, from being irresponsible. They didn't go full Demon in a Bottle. And there are still older comic book fans who say, I can't believe they didn't adapt Demon in the Bottle. And I say, well, it's a children's movie. As much as we like the Marvel flicks, as older adults who grew up with those characters, these are still children's movies. There was no cussing. They limited the amount of blood. There was a lot of cartoonish CGI and cartoonish jokes and stuff like that. But they also tried to bring in some sort of mature theme in terms of, the overall goal of Thanos and stuff like that. But you realize there are certain subjects they're not really going to get into. There are certain things they're not going to do because it's a Disney property. And you have to say the same thing about WWE. And sometimes when WWE does kind of step out of that box, people start to, kind of flip out a little bit. Like, oh, they're going edgy. Like when, just because somebody says shit on NXT, all of a sudden they're going edgy. Mandy Rose shows up in a bikini. Oh my God, they're going edgy. It's like, they're not exactly Muslims right now. It's not like every woman is walking around covered up and wrapped up from head to toe on Raw every goddamn week. Sexiness is part of the show and always has been. It's just because they toned it down to the point where it's not, Sable, with pasties on her chest every week. Or, what was that? Did they have pudding fights during the Ruthless Aggression era where they were fighting in mud wrestling and wrestling in vanilla pudding and stuff like that? Just because they're not doing that stuff anymore doesn't mean that there isn't sex involved in it. It's just not as much. They've toned down a lot of the sex and a lot of the violence have become cartoonish. I remember I sat here and talked about the cartoonish level of violence between Roman Reigns and Kevin Owens, where Kevin Owens was seemingly just, having anvils dropped on him every week and he kept getting back up. And I'm just kind of like, what the hell? Like, what is going on here? But it took a while for it to settle in. You're like, okay, you can't really do stretcher spots because you might scare the children. You do a stretcher spot, it has to be serious or whatever, even though a lot of this stuff really could use some stretcher spots, some realism. The wrestling period has gone off into the realm of the unrealistic. We often talk about how different shows have things that are so silly. And this is what kind of brings me back to the AEW comparison. I'm reading this article, and the first thing when he starts talking about how AEW is a little bit more realistic, I said to myself, did I not see Orange Cassidy, who has arms that look like they're made of, wet spaghetti noodles, wrap his arms around Adam Cole, whose arms are also like wet spaghetti noodles, and he was wiggling and he couldn't get out of it, even though his hands weren't locked, and then they both do-si-dos off the top of that thing, and I was kind of like, that did not have any realism at all. There's a lot of not realism in wrestling, period, nowadays. And that's just kind of how the business has evolved. That we've evolved from the hyper-realism of the 1960s and 70s where, if you punch the guy too many times, somebody better blade because otherwise nobody's going to believe this shit. Where you could power drive a guy on the concrete and that's a stretcher spot. So now you can power bomb a guy on the concrete through the floor and he's going to get up 2 seconds later because it's all Mortal Kombat and nothing matters. That's just the way the business has evolved. And you do have to ask yourself, if you are a person who was more interested in I'm not going to stand still and we're going to do the battle rap promo, which I kind of sometimes go off on when AEW does it and when WWE does it. When, a guy stands there and lets you go off for 3 minutes uninterrupted as you talk about his mom and his children and how much he sucks and, all this kind of stuff, and you just don't do anything. And, like back in the day, you wouldn't even got half as many words out before somebody threw a punch. which is a little bit more realistic, but it's a different audience. It was for a different audience, it was for a different time. The wrestling audience today is a little bit more understanding of the 20-minute promo battle. It's a little bit more realistic. We kind of okay with the 20-minute promo battle. We may say, oh, the segment going a little long, but we're okay with it because we know it's setting up the actual fight later, and that the fight is not about to be right now. It's going to be in a couple of weeks. Back in the day, the fight was supposed to be pretty much immediate. It's supposed to be like, okay, on site. That's where you get the invisible wall. The babyface comes out, chases a guy gets further enough away, the babyface stops running. You're like, oh, that's ridiculous. It's so stupid. It's like, well, that's wrestling what it is now. Either you like it or you don't. So it makes sense. When I was a kid, wrestling was childish. I was 10 years old in 1994. I was 11 in 1995 when we had Doink and Dink and Mantar and Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese Man of War, and all that stuff existed. But it was also childish when I was 6 years old in 1990 because you had the Ultimate Warrior, who's a cartoon character. Sting was also a cartoon character. And these guys literally leapt off the page, if you had a magazine and you saw Sting in it, Sting leapt off that page and you were like, wow, this guy's like a superhero. The Ultimate Warrior, you're like, whoa, he's larger than life. Now you're a grown adult man. You hear these guys grumbling about how bad their knees are. And I never would have wanted to hear how the Ultimate Warrior complained about his back. Like, oh, my back. Oh, it's so tough, Steve. I don't know how long I'm gonna keep having to slam Andre. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear about your weaknesses and how tired you are and how tough it is getting into the airport. That stuff does make you human. And when you're a kid, you don't really want to. You don't want to hear about your dad's bunions or your dad having a headache or a migraine. The thing is, you want to think dad is untouchable. Sure, once you get older, you see that dad is, got calluses on his hands and he has a back brace and maybe, he has to take those little blue pills. But, when you're a kid, you don't want to see that. You don't want to know that. And I think that's the difference between being an adult and being a child. And children today are going to look at some of these guys that we think are jokes or stupid today and say, in 10 years, in 20 years, oh, that was my dude when I was a wrestling fan as a kid. Because I see it all the time. Like I peruse Twitter, especially through the wrestling sections. I used to see all the time people would be super fans of a guy that we consider to be not that big of a deal. Like I didn't realize that there were so many Seth Rollins fans until recently. And a lot of them are younger because Seth Rollins has been around for so long. That they're kind of like, for me, he's kind of like, okay, I remember Tyler Black from Ring of Honor. I was an adult when he came in. But if you were a kid, then yeah, the Shield breaking up is probably one of the defining things of your childhood. Just like when the Rockers broke up when I was a kid. You have to consider that there's a different audience, and taking that into account, I see why so many people may see Seth Rollins as being a big deal. So WWE has to play that tightrope where there's going to be certain things that appeal to the younger audience. That are things that are defining their childhood as it continues to go on right now. And that's something to consider too. In 15 years, when most of us are older and gray, there's going to be people who are going to look back and say, Roman and Brock main evented 3 WrestleManias. That's amazing. Only Rock and Austin have done something like that. While we're grumbling, I can't believe Brock and Roman are wrestling at WrestleMania again. To the kids, they think of this as some kind of massive undertaking. For them, this is a big deal. For them, Charlotte and Ronda Rousey may be a big deal, or Charlotte and Sasha Banks may be a big deal because it hasn't happened that often. Or they remember when it was a big deal on Raw when they were kids. And now they're kind of late teens, early teenagers or whatever. And there's a tease of them going back to it. So yeah, Meltzer is 100% right on this. You have to consider that there's a different audience. But it's not just the 1970s and 1980s. It's Every audience is a different audience. Every several years is a new generation. You know, they're going to have their own Hulk Hogan's in WWE's respect, because they're not going to change their formula, not until Vince dies at least. So they're always going to have their own Hulk Hogan's, whether it's Hogan himself, whether it's Brett, Shawn, Undertaker. You know, they're going to have Cena, Batista, Randy Orton, Edge, all those guys. Edge was a tag team guy when I was a kid. He's a legend, you know, to a lot of people now. That's just the changing of the times. You know, I'm not going to argue and say, oh, he's just a stupid tag team wrestler. I mean, what's the point? I also saw him be a great single star too. Now, do I put him on the same level as a lot of the other guys that I grew up with? No. But that's just my perspective, because I've seen more, you know, but it's something to consider. It's definitely something to consider. And if you are a kid that grew up with Edge slapping John Cena's daddy, that's something that you're never going to forget. Something that you thought was hilarious. And who knows, maybe RK Bro is going to be the rock and sock connection for this generation. And maybe Riddle will go on to become one of the greatest world champions ever. Who knows? You know, it's just something to think about. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll talk to you guys later.